Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lemongrass Roots, where we talk about all things SAP. Today, I'm delighted to have Robert Holland from SAPinsider to join us and talk about a recent report that Robert's authored and released. We're going to double click on that into some detail. So, Robert, welcome to the podcast.
Eamon, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. It's weird. The shoe is on the other foot because usually I'm the one doing the podcast interviews, but it's fantastic to be here. I really appreciate it.
No, it's great to have you. Great to have you. So, Robert, maybe first off, if you want to introduce a little bit about the report itself, and maybe give the listeners a little bit of a feel of the scale, the number of types of customer, etc., that you were chatting to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just throw the report cover slide up here so that we can we can talk through it and a couple of the points we had from the research.
Mhm.
But between July and October of this year, we surveyed 140 folks to get deeper insights, particularly because, obviously cloud adoption is increasing, right? But the real question is, how are people using the cloud, and what are their priorities, and what benefits are they seeing? So, the respondents to the research was about 40, just over 40%, 41% from North America, 39% from Europe. So those were split pretty evenly. 17% from APJ. I'm actually seeing, if you look at the SAP earnings numbers, APJ is the fastest growing market for SAP, but it's also like a third or a quarter the size of, those other two markets, which I think is why there's a much smaller number of respondents there, and then a relatively small number in Latin America, because I think there's just not quite as many cloud options for those organizations. And they came from, across the SAP space. So 29% were from SAP teams, 25% were IT administrators, 19% were IT ops folks. We had developers, 7% basis administrators, systems implementers, and then architecture folks, which were 5%. It's only 5% because there's usually only one at any given company, as against, probably a lot more of some of the other teams. And what I thought was really interesting is that we really tried to evaluate the maturity of people in their approach to the cloud. So where were they on their journey? And that included things asking about, what's the current architecture of your SAP workloads? What's the extent to which you're adopting cloud principles such as containerization, microservices, service meshes, cloud native tools and practices. Now, even though SAP itself doesn't necessarily support cloud native, many of the connected workloads can be used in that manner. And I think that's where, some of the interesting stuff is. And then we sort of scored the responses to those questions and determined maturity, and sort of grouped respondents into three major groupings: those leading in the cloud adoption, so those probably that have been doing it for longer, and that made up slightly over 23% of the respondents. And then we had those who are somewhere in the middle. So I called them in this research the hybrid majority, because they're sort of there. They have a mix of workloads, and that was a mix of infrastructures, and that was 45% of respondents. And then we had the beginners, those who are early in their journey, and that was, I think, 32% of respondents. So, it worked out to be, an interesting breakdown and some interesting data, as we're going to talk through in a second.
It's a great selection of customers as well, and I think we've probably all seen customers in each of those different phases of maturity. So yeah, really, really interesting report, and I think jumping straight into some of those themes and messages that come out of the report quite clearly. The one that really gets me is this sense that the customers who are on the mature side of it, the ones who've been using cloud well and for longer, seem to be the ones who innovate the fastest and adopt new change quicker. Is that generally what you're seeing in the answers?
they're certainly seeing more benefits, I mean, obvious, and for those folks that have been in the cloud longer, I mean, I think my interpretation of it is obvious, they've done the investment maybe a few years back, maybe as
Mhm.
long as 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, depending on where they are in the journey. But that's really starting to pay off for them because it's
Mhm. Mhm.
allowing them to, as you say, innovate faster, to do things more quickly, and to and then, it's also really interesting when you look at the results. They have very different priorities now that they're already on the cloud, and they can start to do some of the things that some of the other folks who are early in their cloud journeys just aren't even really thinking about yet.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and again, it reflects reality because that's what I've seen up close with real customers is that exactly that kind of consequence. People who've taken the leap, who are there, who are maturing, they think differently, and they have different priorities, but they're achieving different value. So maybe we should jump into a couple of those points. Yeah, we've taken a selection from the overall report, which were quite interesting. First one here being around the tools and practices to manage on cloud, and I think this is a great tell as to where you are, even on its own, just seeing this. But maybe you can explain this question a bit to the listeners and some of the observations.
Yeah, absolutely. So this question was part of our maturity assessment. So what we did is we said, well, there's a lot of different approaches you can use. And even though, I know some of these approaches, as I sort of hinted at before, aren't technically supported yet for SAP workloads, that doesn't mean that they're not in use in the organization and in connected tools and systems. And so we sort of said, well, tell us which ones you're using. I mean, select, there's a um, select which ones apply to you. And as we can sort of see, based on that maturity assessment that we did, leaders are far more likely to be thinking about, almost twice as likely as even the majority group to be doing API first development for SAP integration, right? It's like they're really much further ahead. They're thinking about things like continuous innovation and continuous deployment at a much faster pace than others are. Meanwhile, we can sort of see that the beginners are like, well, we're not using any of these tools. We haven't got to that stage yet. And it's sort of interesting to sort of just compare, the bit, and it's not like, and I think what I sort of noted here on this particular question is that the majority are doing the same things as the leaders are, just at a slower pace, right? They're
Mm.
not as advanced. There's not as many of them that have those tools and capabilities adopted, right? I mean, but everyone is kind of doing similar things in terms of what they're adopting. It's just where they are on that journey.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think it's especially as you get into CI/CD and into API, it is a very different world from the on-premise world. Um, and what I'm seeing is that the SAP teams who do this are starting to align more with the rest of the enterprise IT teams. Because the other teams, the web developers and the mobile developers, and they've all been doing this for many years. And there's always been this sort of like two worlds within IT, the SAP team and the non-SAP teams. And cloud seems to be allowing those teams to rejoin, as it were, on common platforms, common development methodologies and tools. So I think it's again a great little picture to illustrate that.
I think that's an interesting point because you're right. I mean, I remember being involved in mobile development when I worked for SAP years ago, and I wasn't personally doing it, but the folks I was working with in my team that were, they were using these capabilities a long time ago. 10 plus years ago, because I've been here at SAPinsider for 6 years, and then I was at SAP so yeah, probably 12 or more years ago, they were using some of these capabilities, and SAP teams have really dragged in well, SAP doesn't support this, SAP doesn't support that. It's like, yeah, but SAP is also now accelerating the push to the cloud, and they're making it so that, it's kind of uncomfortable for customers if they're not embracing that cloud mindset.
Yeah. And I think that's a key word. It's mindset. It is about attitude. It's about it's about how you do the changes and how you look after the landscape. So I think it's a great question and very interesting results. But maybe if we move on to the next question as well, I think talking about priorities and again, I think this is an excellent question because it really demonstrates again the maturity and the way that the mindset that you just mentioned evolves differently after you've been on the cloud for a while. So again, Robert, if you don't mind, just sort of explain the question and some of those responses you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, once we sort of did a maturity assessment and we sort of asked some questions around, well, who's responsible for your cloud strategy, which is interesting. It has some interesting variations in itself, but we're probably not going to get into them here today. We said, what are your priorities? And what I find most interesting here is that the beginners are still involved in reducing their technical debt and trying to get away from their existing monolithic SAP implementations or SAP extensions. Leaders are really thinking ahead, right? They're now their biggest priority, not surprisingly, given how many security patches SAP has released this year, is enhancing security and compliance across all of their environments, right? Not just the cloud environments, but everything that's connected to it. They're far more interested in expanding their cloud native footprint. And so there's, and they've already thought about things like multi-cloud governance because they're doing that at a much lower rate than the other respondent groups because, well, it's something they've already covered.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think this really, really sort of is a great picture of where these organizations are. Beginners are still trying to get going. They're still trying, and it's not necessarily a cheap place to get started because it does take an investment to start moving there. But, the leaders are interested in trying to get more, trying to embrace more cloud for what they're doing in SAP, and particularly they're concerned about security and compliance.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as you say, security, one of the strengths of cloud is great security, but it's also one of the biggest risks. If you don't manage it correctly, you could end up more exposed. So I think that's something that people learn after a while is that sort of subtle double-edged sword nature of security and cloud. But absolutely, I think the more you use cloud, the more you use the tooling to manage cloud, the more you begin to realize what those risks are, and the more urgent you start to treat them. I remember on-premise customers, they wouldn't allow, and some customers would not allow their IT teams to patch the OS from one year to the next because they were afraid it would destabilize SAP. And they would even isolate the SAP system in a separate own network so they could sort of effectively, keep it static. And in the cloud world, that's just not acceptable. It's just not a way you can operate. You have to lean into the change and you have to lean into the tooling and ways of working we just talked about to enable that. So, yeah, I mean, for me, security, I'm delighted to see it up there with the leaders because it is, for me, it'd be the number one priority for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, obviously the operating system providers, if you're running SAP, S/4HANA, or anything related, it's got to be one of those two Linux providers, right? But they're making it easier for people to patch the operating system without needing to reboot, right? So they've matured. At the same time, there's been a need for that maturity to happen, but there's still a concern. I mean, for example, we just published a report on Rise with SAP, so SAP Cloud ERP. And that has a shared responsibility model that not everyone is aware of, right? SAP does some things, but you also have to do some things. And this is what you're sort of talking about with, there's a risk involved with the cloud. And only about 2/3 of respondents who are already running, or in the process of deploying Rise with SAP said they knew about it and were using it and were actively applying it all the time. It's like, okay, well, what are the other third doing? What if you know about this, why is it you're not, emphasizing these things? And so there's definitely some concern out there too.
Mm,
And I know, from conversations I've had with technology leaders, in the last couple of weeks, I mean, some of them weren't even aware of that, shared responsibility model. Now, that could just be because they're CIOs and their teams take care of that stuff. And it's not necessarily something that they personally need to have the details on. But that
mhm.
was a bit concerning for me as well. How do you not know that, just because everything's in the cloud doesn't mean everything is taken care of?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean and that's a maturity thing as well. I think if people consider cloud to be just like Salesforce, where you effectively just have an F5, you get a new version. I mean that's a very modern architecture and very much a SaaS approach. But as some of the products still require awareness, at least of the OS level, awareness of the DB, and certainly for cloud ERP, those are still important things that SAP themselves will surface to you. And once you start seeing that, you need to take care of it as well. As you rightly say, there's responsibility still for customers. In fact, one of the things that we have evolved with customers around is the importance of what does the operating model look like once you get
Mm,
to cloud ERP. In other words, where is that cutoff point between what SAP will do and what a customer and their partner needs to do. And it's precisely as you've talked. For different priorities in different areas, how do you close the gap and make sure that you don't have, as you suggested, some people may have, gaps in their operating model that could be quite risky. Um, so that's something that I think is for most of our customers, what we're seeing is they're moving in that direction and they're changing the operating model to be more cloud aware as part of that transition.
yeah.
Um, if we look at the third question then, and again, this maybe looks at it in a slightly more positive rather than just the concerns and priorities, but also looking at the benefits. And that's something I know a lot of people are looking to still build benefits cases and quantify them. But again, Robert, a great question you asked here. So maybe you can introduce the question and some of your conclusions from it.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, you know, we, we've sort of talked about what are your priorities. We ask people about, even their challenges, but what are the benefits you're experiencing, right? So
Mhm.
because just because the cloud providers tout certain benefits doesn't necessarily mean that that's the same benefits that people are experiencing. As it happens, increased scalability and performance is the biggest benefit that leaders are seeing, which is pretty much what people, cloud providers talk about when it comes to moving to the cloud. Um, what I thought was interesting, and obviously it connects to that security point that we were just talking about with priorities, is improved observability and monitoring. So leaders have more insight into their systems in the cloud than they perhaps did in that legacy on-premise environment. They're able to get extensions or build extensions on top of their applications more quickly. And what I did think was interesting, and this is something that I've sort of seen both in this research and in the research on Rise with SAP, is that those who are further along in the process are actually seeing cost benefits from moving to the cloud. Now, that probably isn't surprising to someone like you, but those who are earlier in the journey are also saying, well, there's a high cost involved in making this switch. And I think that's the transformational cost. And once you sort of get over that hurdle, then you start to sort of see um, operational benefits and a better TCO on moving to the cloud. But yeah, I mean, obviously, um, I thought it was interesting that even those that are the majority that are still sort of somewhere in that journey, they're actually seeing that was cost benefit was the second most likely thing they were experiencing, right behind increased scalability and performance. So it isn't, a it isn't something that is unachievable for organizations. It isn't just a dream. There are actual benefits that you're going to see in moving to the cloud, and not only in terms of your SAP systems, but in terms of how you run your IT organization, and benefits from that as well, and to your business.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned earlier about security being a double-edged sword. So is cost. There are people who've got horror stories of cloud costs running out of control, but to the same point around security, if you know what you're doing, suddenly it becomes very achievable to reduce cost. And if you look at some of the tools and behaviors, some of those reasons are obvious. If you not only are you now starting to use more commoditized architectures and infrastructure, so the unit prices should be lower, but you're also able to get at all of these programmatically. So the cost of operating them from a person point of view should be lower as you automate more of those processes. Of course, SAP themselves automate a bunch of the processes within their RISE operating models that the customers get advantage of as well. But it is interesting, as you say, the first thing, quite early on, those the hybrid majority people are already seeing cost benefits come through. And it is interesting that they might see those before they get to the observability, because again, as you say, that's a bit of a maturity thing, knowing that that's important and what is it you want to see. Observability is very much a cloud concept, separate to monitoring in itself, but it's something that it only becomes obvious after you've been working cloud for a while why it's really important to understand state across a much broader area than just some KPIs that are being monitored. So yeah, again, I think it tells a lot. It tells a real story, this slide. But also, it also, as you say, it holds up the point that there absolutely are benefits here to be accrued if you know where to look for them, and if your team can accelerate towards that level of maturity faster, then you're more likely to get those benefits earlier as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and even for those who are, most mature in their cloud adoption, there's a few that are not seeing benefits. I mean, now, it could just be where they are on their journey, could be the type of environment they have. So it doesn't necessarily happen immediately for everyone and in the same manner, but they are there. Moving to a cloud model does offer significant benefits for the vast majority of the folks that are answering this research.
Fantastic. Okay, Robert, I suppose there was just some questions we looked at. Obviously, there's a lot more in the report, but you concluded with some required actions that you thought might be helpful for readers. So maybe we could just step through those next.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I look at the research, what we're trying to do in all of the research that I write and everything that, a lot of things we do here at SAPinsider is we're trying to bring it back to, well, what you can do to be successful, and and have actual steps that you can take. So the first thing I sort of had in mind here was you need to work with people who are experienced at this stuff, right? If you're gonna drive the success of broader cloud initiatives, you've got to start with someone who knows what they're doing. One of the things we sort of see, in surveying, technology leaders, I think even in this research, is there's a skills gap, right? If your SAP team has been all ABAP, all on-prem for the last 20 years, you've got to ramp them up. And even though your mobile developers and some of your other groups may have already been adopting some of these cloud methodologies, it doesn't necessarily transfer immediately. And then as so many SAP customers are likely to be embarking on transformation over the next few years, there's a bit of a bottleneck coming in terms of finding the right people and getting them on board. So this is where working with an experienced cloud provider, perhaps a little bit like yourself, Eamon, really can help accelerate that success, right? It'll help you get there. It'll help you get there faster.
Yeah, and we see that. I mean, a lot is it's about augmenting capabilities and then trying to, in your own internal operating model, try to transform that model to embed those capabilities. So, for example, we've seen customers who want like an entire new operating model brought to them, versus other customers who say, no, I just need some help on automation, I need some help on migration, I need some help on integration. There's a bunch of areas where they know that, as you say, there's a bit of a skills gap in their team, and they just want help on bridging that gap, knowing that their internal team will pick it up, but can do it quicker with the right partner. So, yeah, I think it's a very pragmatic recommendation, and something that obviously we spend all day with customers delivering. So I think you're dead right as a first action. And then the second one is more about, I think, again, a very pragmatic recommendation, certainly I've seen in the past, around taking baby steps rather than considering this to be a big bang.
Well, and it's an interesting challenge for SAP customers because, many many of those running SAP solutions in the past have sort of done a big upgrade every 5 to 7 years, and it takes 3 years, and it's a big celebration when you reach the end of it. It just doesn't work, in today's environment. If you're moving to the cloud, if you're trying to innovate more quickly, if you're trying to introduce new capabilities to help support the business, you have to be able to deliver and show you're delivering along the way. And, it's interesting because, I was, talking with a CIO of a consumer products company a couple of weeks back, and, they're taking like a 4-year transition approach to Rise with SAP. And, they've got different things that they're doing along the way to sort of demonstrate value, but it's a struggle for them because everything is running in parallel for that entire time, right? But then you've got, another company, who is just doing a big bang project. It's going to take them 2 years. They're going to go away and then they're going to come back and it's all going to be done. Well, maybe, but, that's also got its challenges. But, we heard, I'm just trying to remember the name of the company, but at SAPinsider in Copenhagen, during the keynote, it was a Scandinavian company that got up and talked about, how they gamified it, how they really put in place these measurable milestones, and it really helped make the project successful for them. Did it make it easier? No. Did it reduce the commitment from business teams in ensuring that everything worked? No. But it got everyone engaged through the entire process, and sponsors and leaders and even the business teams could see the benefits as they went through the process.
And I also think, as you say, that there's a certain positivity, almost like a network effect, where if you get some small wins early, it gives you momentum. It gives people faith that you're going to actually complete this journey. And I've certainly worked on projects that have got extremely long gaps between successes, and you can end up really struggling to keep a large team motivated. So, and I think it's the way of the world on cloud as well. Most people outside of the SAP teams are doing daily releases, maybe even many times per day. They're used to micro releases. In the SAP world, we're all very used to these massive changes, but moving a bit more towards the rest of IT has got some really strong benefits. So again, I think a really good action. And then finally, I thought this was a really good observation. I can maybe think a bit if I understood all of the capabilities as well. But maybe you want to talk us through this last observation. I thought it was a great one.
Well, I mean, part of the thinking is that, with programs like, and it's not necessarily unique to Rise with SAP or SAP Cloud ERP Private, whatever we're calling it this month. There's a lot of capabilities that SAP builds into these packages that you can utilize, right? I mean, people are sort of, understand about, the folks from SAP that are assigned to your project, from a technical manager to a, more of a business focus to an enterprise architect, right? They know about these things, but there's a lot there that you can utilize that not everyone is necessarily doing. And my thinking on this is, and the cloud providers do the same thing, right? The AWSs and the GCPs and the Azures, and they're all offering capabilities for cloud transformation that you should learn about and utilize, because it's not necessarily going to cost you an arm and a leg to do that. And if you take advantage of these capabilities, that really will help give you a leg up.
Yeah, again, I think it's such a good bit of advice because, as you rightly say, these very large vendors have got amazing capabilities that they've developed to accelerate migration and transformation, um, and they're more than willing to give those capabilities to the customers. But sometimes they forget to put it on the table, and it's up to the customer then to remember to ask for it. Again, it's something we've done as a partner is coach customers on what to ask for and what's available. And that can have a massive impact on the cost, the timing, and even ultimately the end quality of the solution. But it is a learned skill as well. Once you've gone through a RISE migration, it becomes a bit more obvious. Once you've done a big cloud transformation, the same thing, you will have noticed how the hyperscalers, for example, want to help. But if it's your first time, again, you don't want to pass signing the contracts until you've got a really good idea of have you optimized. So no, I think it's a really good observation, something that will not just make the business case better, but will really plug in on that maturity, accelerate the capabilities of the team, which is, I guess, the underlying theme of the report.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Robert, I have to thanks again for taking us through the report. And I think we'll have a link at the end of this podcast where people can go and have a look at it. I found it really interesting, a great read. So, I want to thank you for your time and for taking us through the detail, answering the questions, and bringing it to life for people. For all the listeners, I would like to thank you again for joining. I highly recommend you track down Robert's online presence for SAPinsider. He writes some great articles and certainly worth a good read. So until next time, I want to thank you all, and thank you again, Robert, for being part of this.
Thank you, Eamonn. It was a pleasure being here.